behalf of the Centennial Committee, students, other guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to join with you all in reflecting with appreciation on the life and work of CLR James, that eminent son of the soil, a true Caribbean man and a worthy prophet of Afro-consciousness in the pre-independence era. When CLR James died in London in 1989, the Independent, a London newspaper, eulogized him as probably the most versatile and accomplished Afro-American intellectual of the 20th century. I am sure that James's classmates from QRC and his friends from the OWTU would have corrected the Independent newspaper by asserting that probably he was the most versatile Trinbagonian intellectual of the 20th century. We have no difficulty agreeing with Andrew Ross of New York University that James had attained such prominence, now matched only by Du Bois. Indeed, we acknowledge that James belonged not merely to Trinidad and Tobago, but he was one of the finest sons of the African diaspora of the last century. The pre-independence decades, it was a period of historic and conscious expressions of a colonial people who challenged metropolitan governance in their demand for constitutional reform, better conditions for the laboring class, and social equity. Let me speak of James as a defender of workers' rights and a champion of labor whose influence extended beyond the shores of the Caribbean. One of James's early experiences of working-class discontent was witnessing the dock workers' strike in Port of Spain during 1919. He was only a teenager, but knew some of the longshoremen who were Afro workers, many of whom were Garveyites, and like James had read Garvey's paper, The Negro World, with its emphasis on race consciousness. James made his contributions to the development of the working class wherever he lived. In England, he interfaced with the Independent Labour Party and the Socialist Workers' Party. He teamed up with George Padmore, another giant in the international black working class movement. In England, he identified with the movements for the unemployed and frequently agitated among British workers for solidarity among the laboring class. In the United States, where he spent 15 years, he appreciated the struggles of the Afro working class and the segregation policies of the United States, which persisted long after emancipation. In 1941, James identified with the striking sharecroppers in southern Missouri, and he inspired them as a lecturer and pamphleteer. June 1937 in Trinidad ushered in a new era in the history of the working class. Whilst the charismatic Tubal Uriah Butler held the center stage, it was the writings of CLR James which give credence to the articulation of the working class in their response to the exploitation and oppression of the oil companies. In the aftermath of the disturbances, British authorities blamed James's publication, The Life of Captain Cipriani, which circulated among workers. It boldly emphasized the need for self-rule and better treatment for the laboring class. Even though James was in England at the outbreak of the riots, his contributions impacted during the crisis. James, a founding member of the International African Service Bureau, spoke at Speaker's Corner, Hyde Park in London, where he defended the striking workers in Trinidad. At Hyde Park, James heckled Marcus Garvey, another remarkable champion of the African diaspora, for his verbal criticism of the Trinidad strikers and West Indian workers. James understood the underlying causes of the strike, the imperatives, political, social, and economic, which inspired the strikes. It was an anti-colonial demonstration by workers who sought the kind of liberation that the Haitian blacks demanded in his work, Black Jacobins. For James, the 1937 strike has been reminiscent of any slave rebellion, a justified cause in the face of agonizing oppression. His understanding of the emancipation of slavery could be applied to any situation where liberation was the objective. To James, emancipation was not a gift from Europe, not a colonial gesture of human sympathy, but the result of self-determination. Therefore, any rebellion against oppression deserved support, and when black workers took the initiative, as they did in 1937, James applauded them all the way. Let me speak of the Workers' and Farmers' Party. James expressed his convictions that it was possible to believe in solidarity, particularly among Indo and African workers. This was an alternative to the racially divisive politics of the PNM and the DLP. These parties politically polarized African and Indians. The ability of James to transcend the racial divide is most apparent in his cordial relations and cooperative efforts with such non-Africans as Adrian Colarienzi, Captain Arthur Cipriani, Walter Anamuntodo, Stephen Maraj, Basdeo Pandey, and Rafik Shah. Not surprisingly, James was one of the prominent figures who disagreed with Dr. Eric Williams, Prime Minister of Trinidad, who indicated in his work Inward Hunger of his preference of keeping the oil and sugar unions divided. James was acutely aware of Williams' interpretation of an unofficial divide and rule strategy adopted from his former colonial masters. In response, James made constant appeals for working-class unity among Indians and Africans. James said, and I quote, "I say it very plainly that there is no salvation for the people of Trinidad unless those two sections of the population get together and work together." End of quote. After the split with the PNM, James felt the passion of again becoming involved in political activity in Trinidad and Tobago, and this eventually materialized with the formation of the Workers' and Farmers' Party in 1965. Indeed, the very name of the party suggests an attempt to bring Afro oilfield workers and the Indo sugar farmers into a close fraternity, at once with political objectives. Unfortunately, the vision of the Workers' and Farmers' Party failed to materialize at the polls in 1966. James left Trinidad, disheartened, disillusioned, and embarked on a tour which involved lecturing to workers in Africa, Europe, and the United States. Indeed, the defeat of the Workers' and Farmers' Party was a major blow to James's ego and affected his political credibility. Added to this was his disappointment with Dr. Williams and the PNM regime, which drove James for yet another time into self-imposed exile. Trinidad and Tobago would have been grateful if he remained a little longer to assist in strengthening the leadership during the 1970s at the height of the Black Power movement, or in the formation of the United Labour Front in 1975. This was yet another effort of working-class organizations for trade unions. It was a kind of adventure in working-class cooperation which James would have certainly approved. Since its inception, labor organizations in this country, such as the Trinidad Working Men's Association, have always been a force which challenged colonialism's economic, social, and political structures. Working-class leaders as Captain Cipriani and Tubal Uriah Butler, they have always been dismissed by the establishment as troublemakers, rabble-rousers, and agitators capable of inciting unrest among the masses. It was from this matrix that the OWTU emerged. In the late 1950s, when James returned to Trinidad, the OWTU was the strongest, best organized, and most influential union in Trinidad and Tobago. Thus, it was inevitable that James would be attracted to this union, which was predominantly Afro-based and whose struggles in South oil industry was reminiscent of the universal working class struggles against oppressive labor conditions in the United States and Europe. The OWTU, with its predominantly Afro working class membership, struggled against oil companies and their exploitative policies. Workers made their demands, but James gave them philosophical and ideological justification. An ideological foundation brought the struggle not merely for bread and justice, but also for the right to govern themselves. One of James's early contacts with the OWTU occurred in 1958 with John Rojas, President General of the OWTU, who visited Venezuela and returned with copies of labor legislation which he discussed with James. But James and Rojas only worked for a short time together. The relationship soon soured because of ideological differences, particularly the modus operandi of the trade union movement. Rojas was quite uncomfortable with the Marxist philosophy of James. James regularly addressed meetings organized by George Weeks and other OWT leaders. Possibly it was the failure of Rojas to be more accommodating to the new ideas and changes within the OWTU, some of which was supported by James, that ended the presidency of Rojas in 1961. In August 1962, a red letter day, former president of the OWTU, Rojas, in a speech in Senate, charged that Marxists were operating within the trade union movement and also among the OWTU. James was accused of operating within the OWTU communist cells in Faizabad, Pointe-a-Pierre, and San Fernando. Rojas denounced the existence of study groups within the OWTU, which attracted radical and educated elements of the trade union movement. He drew reference to a conversation with James in July 1962, in which James spoke about a revolution in Trinidad in 18 months. Despite attempts to portray James as a left-wing radical who was a threat to union stability and also the colony's democracy, James enjoyed considerable support among the OWTU's membership. For instance, in 1961, Lennox Spear, legal advisor of the OWTU and an activist, invited James to lecture on Marxism and its relevance to the trade union movement in Trinidad. At the 28th anniversary of the OWTU, James was one of the speakers, among who were George Weeks, Butler, J.B. Kelchel, Adrian Colerienzi, the union's first President General. It was evident, very evident, that James was regarded by the OWTU as a valuable resource person. The OWTU was one of the few, if not only, organizations in Trinidad and Tobago which recognized the social significance of James's convictions and which appreciated his intellectual mind. James in 1965 praised the OWTU, and he made some remarks which is still relevant today, and I quote, "The OWTU is fighting the battle of democracy in Trinidad and Tobago. If the OWTU goes down, the union rights go down. The liberties of every citizen of Trinidad and Tobago will not only be in peril, they will be tottering on the edge of extinction." 2 years later, James addressed the OWTU again at their conference of delegates. It came as no surprise that James would be later awarded this country's highest honor, the Trinity Cross, and the OWTU's prestigious Labor Star. In conclusion, for us in the 21st century, this memorial of CLR James ought to be more than the reading of another chapter in the lives of great men. And of what do they remind us? Of the need for greater and more sustained efforts in the struggle which we must continue towards the realization of social justice, the restoration of dignity of the laboring class, and the liberation of all oppressed peoples in any society, anywhere in the world. These were certainly concerns of CLR James. I thank you.